Donkey Kong for the Atari 7800 Pro system is fairly close to the arcade original, and is also comparable to the Nintendo Entertainment System version that was also available at the time. The gameplay is classic Donkey Kong, guiding Jumpman through 3 screens of platforming greatness to rescue the girl from the eponymous ape himself. Yeah, this version is also missing the conveyor belt scene, but that's okay. The rest of the game is still here. You're still jumping over barrels, you're still hopping platforms, and you're still picking off bolts to lay claim to the girl for about 5 seconds before the whole game loops all over again. It's straight, simple stuff that has a certain charm to it, and a certain element that makes Donkey Kong a fun game to play even today. Control's an integral part of any video game, but perhaps more so in Donkey Kong. Playing this on the stock Pro Line controller is passable, perhaps even workable, but ideally I plug in the gamepad and use that instead. The results being controls that feel much more responsive and hands that feel much happier that they're not so cramped up. Even so, I've noticed times where I would get stuck on ladders and end up colliding with an oncoming barrel or a springboard of death. These instances are few in between, but they do happen, and they can mess up your game. And Donkey Kong tends to be pretty challenging in its own right, especially in later loops when everything's much faster and shot out in greater abundance. Of course, you could always choose a difficulty setting to suit your own playing skills. The level design in Donkey Kong is closer to the NES version than the arcade original. In fact, the game has more in common with the NES port than the arcade original, if that makes any sense. It's probably for this reason alone that the 7800 conversion sort of feels like a lower resolution version of that NES port. Graphically, it looks fine. Jumpman is Jumpman. Donkey Kong is clearly Donkey Kong, the girl is clearly the girl. You can recognize everything on screen like the barrels and the flames and whatnots. And of course, everything has been stretched out to fit the horizontal plane because Donkey Kong was vertically inclined in its original arcade incarnation. And the game looks fine, a little rough around the edges, you know, it's not quite sharp as the NES port, but it looks fine nonetheless. Sound, on the other hand, is pretty poor, one would say abysmally so. While the melodies are tolerable to a point, they are often buried by much worse sounding sound. Jumpman's constant walking sound, which resembled squeaky boots in the arcade original and even the NES version, sounds horrifically scratchy here, and the bouncing springs are almost akin to dripping water at night keeping you awake. The Atari 7800 has seldom few memorable sounds worth its while, but most sound better than this, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, but this is just poor sound quality at its worst. Overall, Donkey Kong for the Atari 7800 is a great conversion of an arcade classic. While it seems to lack polish in some areas, it's still a pretty good port and a fun game to boot. It is a far cry from the 2600 version that was released years prior, and only a tad worse than the NES conversion, with poor sound and occasional control issues being the main sticking points. If you already have the NES version, there's really no point or reason to pick up this 7800 conversion, since they're practically the same game save for some minor points. But still, Donkey Kong is a nice addition to the Atari 7800 library and worth giving a try for a quick fix. And hey, in the long run, you can't go wrong with Donkey Kong. With few exceptions.